Cool, Ben.
We did it.
Yeah, here we are. Here we are, a few more gray hairs. Well, at least for me anyway. You're looking pretty good, actually.
Yeah, jeez, I don't know,
Still
man.
looking young and youthful. So you're about to launch your latest endeavor next month?
Yeah, announce at least. Launch is just a little bit later, but yeah.
We'll get into the details of it.
Yeah.
But here you are, I don't know, about a decade or so later, after you first started, when I first started chatting to you anyway. I'm sure you're involved with games a little bit before that. But how are you feeling? How are you feeling about the local South African indie development, game development industry?
Yeah, I mean, a lot has changed and also not a lot has really changed. We haven't really had that many new studios starting or like operating at like a international standard, I think. We've definitely have, a lot of incubators come out. We've had so many people graduate from university with training now. Free Lives continues to, do really, really well. 24-bit porting, like 50 people now got bought by Annapurna. So it's a lot of the same people doing a lot of the same stuff. And I think it's maybe been a bit difficult for newer entrants to break in at a certain level, but we obviously do have a bunch of new studios. So yeah, I mean, in some ways it's been somewhat stagnant, but with some small little growth here and there. Yeah.
So I remember shortly after would it be fair to say your first major release, The Semblance?
Yeah.
That was end 2017?
Mid-2018.
2018. Yeah. We had an interview with you guys, yourself and Sukiya. I remember, for some reason, I remember a particular scene. We had you set up on a table like this, and Sugar at the time was very excited. He was like, the local scene, it's hot. It's like an exploding star. Yeah, you had all these, these burning elements making up, the stuff were all made up of star material. There was a particular mood at that time, and it was quite a while ago. It was a good 7 years or so. You say your feelings are just as optimistic, or has it shifted a little bit?
No, I'm still optimistic. I think I'm just impatient. It feels like we've been on the cusp for so long of like really blowing up. I just think maybe my standards and expectations of where I want the scene to be haven't been reached. But there's definitely great stuff that's happened since then. I just don't know if the star has exploded yet. I guess stars take a while to explode, maybe, in the metaphor.
Do you think it will?
I think it could. I mean, part of what we're doing with our project hopes to help make that happen, to be honest. It's a big part of why we're making the game we are making in the way we're making it. But I'm not sure, based on what's out there right now, I don't see it happening anytime soon, just yet.
So in preparation for this, because maybe it's more complicated for me simply because I've been talking to you for a while. So I know that, and I've chatted to a number of your guys on your team, which we'll talk about a bit later as well. But it's important for me to kind of put a phrase together and sort of help me understand the scope of the project, but also the angle in which I'm intending to speak to you from. So I wrote, can I read it to you? I wrote you a little something. Well, I didn't write it for you. I said, in essence, Nyamakop is making large, high-budget cinematic game that is deeply rooted in real-world African cultural heritage and the complex issue of repatriation, while simultaneously striving to be a commercially viable and engaging product for a global audience. I think I got that right.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
This involves a continuous balancing act between historical accuracy, social commentary, artistic vision, innovative gameplay, and the practicalities of production and market perception. So given that, how are you sleeping at night, man?
Pretty poorly. Pretty poorly. I think I've been stressed and anxious for about 5 years at least. I think with announcement happening next month and then launch as well, it's not going away anytime soon. Yeah.
So let's get stuck into that. The development of this studio. It's the largest, or that we're aware of, the largest single budget, single project.
Yeah.
Game that's been coming out of the region, probably ever.
Yeah.
That's no small thing. So I do want to get into that relationship, how it got started.
Yeah, so I mean, outside of that, it's the single largest project by team scope, size, and budget. But we're also making an engine that no one's ever worked in before with a team that's never shipped a game in, at least in their role they're currently in, with experimental gameplay and untested audience. So,
And you're doing it in Africa.
and in Africa, yeah.
We'll get into that cliche in a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, essentially what happened is we launched Semblance in 2018, did very well critically, but not very well financially. We didn't recoup the investment from the publisher. And then me and Sugar, my co-founder, we were prototyping ideas, trying to figure out like what the next thing was. And then we actually both made functional prototypes. And then we showed them to our friends, our Swedish friends at Landfall. And we were like, what do you think of these? And they were both like, these both suck. But I had another idea for a game, which was just a pitch line and a piece of concept art. And I showed them that. And they were like, you should make this. So just one line and a piece of concept art over 2 functional prototypes. They were like, you should make this. So then we didn't really have enough time we were running out of money pretty quickly. So we didn't have enough time to really make a fully functional prototype. So we started putting together a pitch deck and sort of made a prototype video. So it looks like the gameplay is actually happening, but it only exists for the video. And then put that all together. We went to GDC, we pitched it, and no one wanted to publish it.
Can I ask how you're pitching it? Like, what was the original pitch deck? Is it look like what you're going to be releasing, or is it completely different?
Pretty vastly different in terms of art style, gameplay, production value, even like overall theme to some extent. That game was Afrofuturist, while this is more African futurist, which is a delineation we can get into. But the same, you can see the game there, but it's pretty vastly different in every aspect. Yeah.
Okay.
Even in budget.
So so that initial pitches, you're saying guys weren't really interested. So how did that work?
So that was quite a while before that happened. So
and how did that happen?
So I mean, it's a long story. I mean, right after that happened, essentially we ran out of money, and me and Sugar had both been living at home with our parents the entire time we'd been making Semblance. So Sugar was like, I can't really do this anymore. I need to like get a job, which was obviously fair enough.
We're all in that space.
Yeah. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. I mean, you know, it's like a breakup with a co-founder leaving. So it was obviously intense for both of us, but we sort of got over it. And then we started hanging out a lot outside of that. But for me, I still really thought this game was worth making. And so I sort of lucked into getting a cut of a deal I didn't really have any reason to get from basically a finder's fee, I guess, which was pretty lucky. And then from that, I actually got a loan, I think it was roughly $70,000 from Landfall, our Swedish friends, which is 70% of the budget of Semblance.
Oh, interesting.
So the sort of commitment to a different tier was already starting to grow. And so with that, I was able to hire like 1 or 2 people. And then early in that year, it must have been 2020, I got an email from an agent at United Talent Agency, UTA. It's like one of the 2 big Hollywood talent agencies. And he was like, I'm an agent. I want to sign you guys. Are you interested? And based on our experience we'd had at GDC pitching before, and me also now trying to increase the budget of the game, because I was assuming that was the part of the issue, is the production value, we decided to sign with him. And then he ended up pitching it to people there's no ways we would have ever been able to reach.
So that's why that happened. Okay. All right. I mean, I kind of knew that, but I didn't know the story behind it.
And at this time, Sugar was actually back at Nyamakop as essentially an employee. And so he at the time was heading up the tech of the project. And so I went to him and I was like, do you think we can do this? And he was like, I think so. It'll be hard, but we'll do it. So we sort of were prototyping in Unity at the same time as we were learning how to make Unreal Engine at the same time, make it work. And then yeah, we did that prototype for, I don't even know, it might have been a year, 9 months or something. And then, yeah.
So what personal lessons do you take away from that journey? Because that's a bit of a mission. That's a bit of, that's living in uncertainty. It's, at the end of the day, it's taking a risk. Any creative project like this, you're taking a risk at some point. Personal risk, financial risks. You know, the lessons that you'd communicate from that, would that be something along the lines of never give up, or what's your, or?
What lessons? It's tricky. I think what I was surprised by, we made Semblance, which was a small game, $100,000 budget, 200,000 in general. Yeah.
But what I mean, though, you must have had some sort of gut feeling to say, I'm just going to keep going.
Yes.
Yeah.
I did fundamentally. I believed in the idea wholeheartedly because I'd never in my entire life pitched an idea to someone, and no matter who I pitched it to, the response was positive, of just one sentence. And it just told me the concept inherently was so strong, the hook for the game was so strong that it deserved to be made. And I think it also spoke to a general belief I had in the ciphering games industry, the African games industry, who was getting to make games about what. And then this concept comes along, which sort of encapsulates and allows me to actually make an African-inspired game, which might actually be commercially viable for the first time. And I just couldn't give up on that. And then I just started having all these wins, slowly accruing more and more support and funding. And I think the belief came from obviously the concept, but there was a window of about 18 months, maybe to 2 years, where it was just me, still living with my parents, trying to figure out how to make it work. So there was a lot of stubbornness and a lot of luck and the ability to actually even do that without any funding at all, because I was still supported by my parents. Not many people get to have. So I guess the lesson is be born privileged.
Yeah, but also but also just, you know, make best of what you got, you know?
Yeah.
So I think just for listeners and the watchers, maybe it might be the right time to just get into the actual project, because you've said a lot of things now that I wanted to get into, like that Afro's futurism, future of Africa, but also you're talking about African-inspired game.
Yeah.
So I think before we get into this concept, maybe just give us a holistic pitch of what the actual game is that you're announcing next month, which technically this will come out after you announce it, but nevertheless, this is a pre-launch launch.
Yeah, so we're making Relooted, which is an African futurist heist game where you reclaim real-life looted African artifacts from Western museums. Features over 70 artifacts, and all of them are real, and as of today, reside in Western museums. Artifacts from all over the continent, everything from the more famous things like the Benin bronzes to things that have essentially been in the British Museum storage for the last 100 years, and no one's seen them for that amount of time. And it's a non-violent heist game, which there aren't really a lot of. So trying to figure out how to do that was also a very interesting challenge. But yeah, it's a heist team made up of everything you'd expect: an acrobat, a hacker, the muscle, and they're all from a different ethnicity and nationality. It's got some really great music. We've got an amazing story. Also, story-wise, adapting the heist genre to be about why people would steal stuff not for money has also been really tricky and challenging. But yeah, that's generally the project, I guess.
So not a difficult one, easy project. Not touchy, not sensitive.
Pretty much nothing has been easy
with
this
culturally,
game.
No cultural touch points there in any way.
Nope.
There's so many elements of the game creation. Just again for the watcher, I have chatted to a number of his staff, his kind of guys that work in different departments. So I did get some stories from them and their particular challenges, whether that's animation, gameplay, narration. Yeah. Unfortunately, I haven't chatted to your writer yet. I really wanted to chat to her. Yeah. In fact, I still will, but we just didn't get around to it. Maybe let's talk about the cultural sensitivities of it. Most of the things, I suppose you're in this fine balancing game between making a good game that's playable to anyone around the world, while at the same time being sure that you're kind of on point with the narration or the purpose of the story. And what I mean by that is you don't want to or be labeled as a woke game, or you don't want to be labeled as like a, you know, like one of these, like a culturally
appropriate to involve.
Yeah, you don't want to. You either risking cancellation or you're risking like you know. There's so many different elements there. That's a fine balance, and then on top of that, you have to make a good game.
Yeah.
So maybe, I mean, you must have had numerous conversations about this.
Numerous conversations, thoughts, everything. On one side, you're right. We might be cancelled for being too woke. On the other side, I might be cancelled for being the white CEO making this African-inspired game. It's been very, very difficult. I think in terms of product versus art, I think it is possible to make pop culture that also teaches people things. Growing up, my parents didn't let me used to play a lot of games, and the games I did play, they had to be educational somehow. So one of my favorite games growing up was Age of Empires, which is about, you know, the history of ancient empires, and that really got me into history. And then funnily enough, last year I met, I think he must have been the lead game designer at Age of Empires 2. And I was like, oh, why did you make this game? You know, you must love history. And he was like, no, honestly, I just didn't have to pay anything for the IP. And I was like, okay, that's a good reason, I guess. But like that game taught me a lot about history. And so I thought the idea of making this game as sort of a vehicle and also a entry point for Africans, the African diaspora, the world really, to learn about African culture, identity, and ethnicities, as well as like these artifacts. Like the thing about these artifacts is they're not like trinkets. We're not talking about like plates. We're talking about like these things that have huge spiritual, cultural, like value to the people they were taken from, you know? And even as someone living on the continent, I had no idea about these artifacts and where they were. So I think that sort of invitation for people to learn about it is great and cool, but you almost have to hide it in the game itself because, like you said, there still has to be commerciality to it. You have to be still wanting to try and make money and keep making games. So the balance has been very, very tricky for a lot of different reasons. And some of it's been data-driven. Some of it's just been good old play testing and figuring it out. The sort of level of research you've had to do for the artifacts, you've had to be extremely, extremely careful.
So I did want to touch on the research a little bit. Because it's a big project. It's not like, and there's not necessarily great, I suppose it depends on the artifact and where it is, but there's not necessarily a great sort of, what do you call it, provenance. The history of that particular artifact is not always easy. And you have to get it right. Like the credibility, even though it's kind of like the backdrop to the game, right? But there's still it's the credibility of the research. There's something that comes through when you've done good research on something, whether it's actually an active part of the direct, whatever you're producing, whether it's a book you're writing, whatever. Yeah. And the anecdote I use for that is, like Tolkien in Lord of the Rings, like he wrote this whole background world lore, but it's not really directly relevant in the story. The story is just still the story. It's a good story, but because he's done so much work into the bedrock of what you're producing, and I think the same kind of goes for this project. It's not necessarily in your face, but it's something that's going to lend itself to just a really good depth to what you're playing.
No, 100%. I mean, the game is actually very, very lighthearted and funny and joyful, which is another thing we spoke about a lot. It's like setting the game in the future. You don't really get to see Africa in the future, like real Africa in the future. And you also don't very often always get to see, at least in Western media, like Black joy and Black happiness. Mm-hmm. So that was something that was really important for our team to like focus on. And we could have easily gone the different direction, sort of like lent into the darkness and the sadness of these artifacts being taken. But, and it's there still, but the way the team, like the actual heist team, talks about and engaged with it is relatively lighthearted. But on the research side, we had a researcher full-time for, I think, 18 months to 2 years. We had one guy full-time hand modeling recreations of those artifacts based on just photos. We had another person who produced our pronunciation guide, and she was just reaching out to people all over the continent from that ethnicity or that tribe or that country where the artifact is from and asking them, how do you pronounce this? And they would send voice notes. And then when we did voice recording like 2 weeks ago, we were playing that voice note for our voice actors being like, this is how you have to pronounce it. And I agree. I think the depth of that is like, it adds a layer to the game. But I also think, again, it's this invitation for people to learn about the continent and its people and its cultures. So making sure what they're learning is accurate is probably also a good idea. So
your idea of, and I haven't just heard it from you. I heard it from your animator. Let me quote him as well. He said, Nyamakop's key strategy and goal right now is an African-inspired games for a global audience. Continues, but that's the particular point I wanted to get at. When you say African-inspired, what do you mean by that? It brings up, and I've had this conversation with you, but numerous other developers locally as well. In terms of, I don't mean this disrespectfully, but the cliche of the African story.
Yeah.
How did you guys navigate that, Drew?
I think it's still something I think about a lot and I'm concerned about a lot for sure. Because I think I've always wanted to make African-inspired games, but I was like, I'm a white guy, that doesn't necessarily feel appropriate. But almost on the commercial side, there isn't much evidence, and still to this day, isn't much evidence that African-inspired games specifically have an audience. There have been attempts, and part of the way I've made this game specifically is to try and address why some of those attempts might have failed. But still to this day, there isn't really evidence that there's a huge audience for that. And so we're making...
What would you consider an example of a breakout? What, Black Panther or something?
Well, I'm talking about games specifically. In every other medium, there's many examples. Film, music, TV. There are many examples in other media, but not in games specifically. And around the time I started working on this project, Black Panther came out, right? So I had this idea in 2017, Black Panther came out, and then I was like, oh, this might be a turning point where like there really is a hunger for African-inspired content. But in games, there's still not much evidence. So when we say African-inspired games, one of the other things we talk about, I think you can think of it two ways. We talk about sometimes incidentally African-inspired games, which is like when you play certain games, you know, they're themed Greek, they're like ancient Greece or Norse mythology or whatever. There are people that play the game for that, but a lot of people probably aren't necessarily playing God of War because they're that into Norse mythology or Greek mythology. It's almost incidental. It's inspired, but like the production values, the stories, everything about those games is so good that it attracts this huge audience that might not actually care about that setting. So they're almost incidentally themed in that way. And I think at Nyamakop, going forward, depending on how this game does for sure, but we always want to think about being incidentally African-inspired. The first thing we have to think about is quality and concept first. And then the African theming of it is almost incidental because it has to not matter to the player that it's African themed. The rest of the game has to be so good that if they don't care about that part, they still want to play the game. And I do think the concept we have sort of does that. But I think the other way you can think about it is like, it's difficult, if you make a game and you're based in Africa, it's difficult to get away from it being African-inspired in general. Like even when you don't notice it. Like Free Lives, you know, makes very sort of like parodies or satires of Western media and then sells it back to the West. But, you know, one of their releases, Angerfoot, if you play that and you're South African, you can clearly tell they're making fun of Johannesburg very clearly. So that's an example, like, is that African inspired? Is that African themed? I think it is, right? It doesn't have to be as aggressive as like spraying Indabele patterns all over the wall or whatever, right? The idea of what is African inspired can be quite broad, but I think in the Nyamakop sense of things, this game is a big test for how aggressively we can theme something African. But at its core, we always want it to be incidental.
It's difficult. I suppose that's why, you've had numerous people come in and out of the studios and just kind of chatting to them and just getting the balance right. I suppose it's a matter of clicking in, right? Like you kind of keep talking about it, click in, because there's a, I chatted to this, one of the new entrants to the local scene. We had been an interview with her, and I was talking to her about, the cliche of African storytelling. There's always someone with a spear or something like that, or there's always some sort of bad accent, that no one speaks like this anywhere on the continent, but nevertheless it's considered an African accent, right? To get those kind of things right, like, how do you? I mean, I haven't heard you guys' audio yet, so I don't know. But I'm sure we talked about it.
Yeah.
So it's like, you almost want to be in a space where, fine, you got to attract a global audience, or you can't be too pushy about being African, but you also want them to understand that, okay, yeah, this is from a different part of the world. This is from Africa, while at the same time not disrespecting or being a cliche to the storytelling here.
Well, I mean, I think with our game specifically, the sort of African story thing, it's like what you often see is it's set in the past, or it's very tribalistic with these African stories, right? I think, so one of the things we wanted to do was like, what does Africa in the future look like? That was one of our big things, because it's like, no one's really tried to do that in games, at least. And even in other media, there were limited examples when we started, at least. And I think that also helps you move away from that sort of like particular African story cliche, because you're looking at like, okay, what does it look like in the future? But authenticity is like hugely crucial to us, but we have to find a balance, right? Like, our voice cast is amazing. Like, we've got this really great list of people. We've got Jerry Mofokeng, who was in Tsotsi as one of our villains. We've got Abigail Kubeka, Masasa Mbangeni. We've got like this amazing voice cast, and we ask them to just speak in their natural accent, because we're very tired of that sort of like African accent as well. I think the game is probably the most authentic and diverse collection of African accents, definitely in a game, but maybe in any medium ever. We've got like Angolans, we've got people from Francophone Africa. It's just like amazing. But at different points, what I used to do is I send clips of those to people in the West and be like, do you understand what they're saying? I was always doing these little check-ins, always with Western colleagues and friends, to be like, how's this reading to you? How's this happening? The whole of development, I've been sending it to the West all the time to be like, this part, how do you feel? I wouldn't necessarily always change it if there was a problem, but I was always sort of temperature checking how the reception in the West might be.
Every time I talk to you, the scope of how I'm kind of understanding the scope of this project gets bigger and bigger for me. Yeah. The question I have for you is, how many firsts are here for you? As the boss, but as in terms of personal development and the scope of how many things you have to manage? I mean, there must be loads of firsts for you.
Hundreds, probably. I mean, Semblance was like 2-3 people full time, 7 people in total, and we peaked at about 32 people full time on this project. And that's excluding the voice cast, 25 minutes of hand animated cinematics, 50,000 words, all fully voiced. It's probably like 15 to 20 hours of gameplay. It's vast. And there's a lot of stuff I've never done before, and no one I'm working with has ever even been close to doing before. So there's a huge amount of figuring out, and we've been very, very lucky that we haven't suffered more in terms of like doing some of that stuff for the first time, but I couldn't even count the number of firsts, to be honest.
Yeah. I suppose again, around the scope of it, was there a feeling inside of you where you said, either, look, we're either going in here, we're going big, or not?
That's pretty,
yeah.
Yeah. So there's a few underlying theories to the game. There's so many, like sort of this huge collection of elastic bands like pulling the game together. But the underlying theory is like, there is no evidence that African-inspired games have an audience. And there's a lot of really good advice about why that might not be. And I decided to try and see if that advice might be wrong. So I wasn't necessarily ignoring it. I was very aware of the advice and the information out there. But I wanted to see if maybe a few things were an issue. So I came across a study, for example, I can't remember who it's by at the moment, but 73% of African Americans play video games, which by percentage is the single largest demographic in the US. Who's making games for African Americans at the very least? The African diaspora in general is probably 200 million people. So often when we talk about African-inspired games, it's always focused on making games for the continent, right? But if there's 200 million people out there, and let's say, even like 30% of them play video games, that's a pretty huge audience that might be interested in like African-inspired stuff. So when we talk about global African-inspired games for a global audience, the big part of that global audience we're hoping to reach is the African diaspora. So my big theory initially was we're making African-inspired games, so we're trying to sell them to Africans. But that's super difficult for a huge variety of reasons we can get into. Why don't we try and sell them to the West, which no one has really tried to do, except maybe one recent attempt. And then my second thought, which will get me in a lot of trouble for saying this, but unfortunately it's true.
That's why we're here, man.
Yeah. I think, unfortunately, most of the African-inspired games that have been made have not been very good, at least in terms of gameplay. Gameplay is a huge problem, I think, on the continent. But the sort of additional part of that is the production value is never high, right? And so I always wonder, people look at a game and they're like, this doesn't look great. I'm really interested in African-inspired games, but it doesn't look great. And they can't get over that hurdle of the production value or the quality not being good enough. So slowly over time, the budget just creeped up and creeped up and creeped up as I try to find more ways to improve the production value. So the big theory is like sell to the West, particularly the African diaspora, and make sure that production value and quality is as high as you possibly can get it. I think if this game doesn't do well, might be a while before any African-inspired game ever does well.
Pressure.
The pressure is huge. I can tell you the conversations people have with me about how it has to work. Because if it does work, and I say this to the team, it changes who can make games about what. Definitely in Africa, but...
It reminds me of, so in December this year at the Africa Games Week down in Cape Town, Nick Hall said something on stage. You guys were talking about funding. I think you might have been on the same panel. There's something you said in the panel, which we'll get into, and you mentioned it just now, but also Nick said something along the lines of investors are not coming to invest in games here because there's nothing worth investing in. That's paraphrased, I'm not sure, but that was essentially the quote. And that panel discussion, I remember there's a few guys in the audience that piped up in that discussion as well. And you said something which at the time, and you said it quite directly, and I thought, ooh, that's a bit cold. And you said the solution is just make better games, which is as a concept, yeah, of course, but in practice, that's obviously a lot harder said than done. So maybe just, what were you thinking when you said that?
I think what I really wanted to avoid, and this is kind of talking about like the South African scene in general, or the African scene, it's like been around so long, at least since 2012, right? Following the broader scene in Africa and South Africa, it just feels like we're not getting as far as we should. And the issues we're always talking about are no funding, no talent, all this sort of stuff. But it feels like we're never having the honest conversation of like, is what we're making good enough? Like, Nick is right. Like, how can you complain about there not being funding when the stuff you're making maybe doesn't deserve to be funded, At this point, Nyamakop is probably raised in project funding pretty close to it, right? Between two projects. There's clearly people that are okay funding African game studios. If we split that amount up to multiple games, that's like a lot of semblances, right? So I'm not a genius either, that's the thing. So there clearly is people who want to fund things in Africa. They don't really care that it's in Africa, but there just maybe isn't stuff that's good enough yet. And I feel like until we as the scene and the community start having that conversation more plainly, we're not going to solve the problem. So that's why I said it so bluntly. How to get there is a different story, but need to start with the games aren't good enough. I'm
also reminded of something else you said. I think it might have been on the same panel. You said celebrating ourselves locally it's kind of like just one big jerk circle, really. It's just kind of like you're not, at the end of the day, your game has to compete globally. Your platforms for most people to access games is through platforms like Steam, etc. So you're not, like personally, if I'm a gamer, like why should I give a shit if a game is made in Africa, quote, air quote. What does it matter to me? Not really. But if it's a good game, it's a good game. Like that's it. So you're competing on a global scale. And in reference to your point of just make better games, I think if you get away from, and I probably agree with you, I had to put some thought into it though, in the sense of like, sure, you've got to celebrate the wins you get here. Like if you make a good game locally and it doesn't make it big, fine.
Yeah.
Outside of South Africa, to be honest, how many people know about Semblance?
Surprisingly many. I wish more of them had bought the game, but I was surprised. Yeah.
Semblance is referred to
at least in the industry, at least. Yeah.
Oh, sure, yeah. But I mean, like as a player, as a gamer. And the reason I say is because it's referenced a fair amount locally, in academic circles or like the things like the Fakugezi Awards. So they'll have those panels and people refer to Semblance. Yeah. So it comes up a fair amount of times because it was a good production. It was a good game. Yeah. I finished it. I played it. I finished it. Besides it not being commercially successful, is it something that you feel was only kind of celebrated here, or is it? No,
I mean, we traveled the world with Semblance. The exhibitions I got into. I mean, we won a game design award in Japan at Bit Summit, like best game design of show. We were nominated for several awards. The press coverage we got is insane. It's still in the top 100 rated games on PC, according to Metacritic. And we know how many games come out every year, but according to Metacritic, the average score from critics puts it in the top 100 PC games of that year. So Semblance helped us break into the industry in some ways, right? So I think Semblance did the same things locally. It got into like local shows, did all that sort of stuff, like whatever was at that time. But it also did travel internationally and was, at least maybe not successfully, but it was competing internationally. So I think my experience with Semblance is possibly also where these thoughts have come from, in terms of like, once you've put yourself out there and you've really seen what it's like to compete with the internationals out there, it sort of changes your standards and your ideas of where we need to be and the games we need to make.
There's a fair amount I want to get into there, but just in terms of, again, that panel whereby, it got a little bit fiery, eh? So I remember Danny from Desktop Dungeons, former fame, or still fame, and he still does stuff. He piped up and he said, but it's really hard. It's hard to make a good game. There's nothing easy about it. There's so many different moving parts there. How would you frame it from advice? So say, for example, your post-launch of this particular game, you frame it advice as like, your advice is simply just, your metric for making a good game is that part of this particular project, Relooted, is, I almost see it as, are you raising the benchmark a little bit, saying, okay, it's possible. The number, it's a big number, but technically it's only like, it's not from a game perspective. It's actually not that big of a thing, but it goes really far here,
Which is also part of the other theory. It's like making bigger budget games in South Africa.
But I remember we were talking about that 10 years ago. Like you in the sense of like, okay, this particular, this framework of it's cheaper to make games here. The skills are here for the most part. There's a certain experience levels that's being developed. And I did want to talk to you about your recruitment. Why aren't more studios coming here then? If you're increasing the benchmark, saying, okay, you've managed to break through, you had the credibility of producing games like Semblance that did lead on to these bigger projects. But you're raising the benchmark from a production perspective. Do you feel now that just makes it easier for others to make it up there? Or, you're not the only example of a successful studio. But you are the only example of like a single project, big budget so far? Would we consider it's a double A studio?
Triple I think was the term thrown around for a
Triple
while.
I, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, so there's multiple things. I think this project could fail completely and make zero money back, and I think it would still be a pretty huge success for a variety of reasons. Because we have said, okay, this is now the benchmark of what games you can make in Africa. Like Free Lives makes amazing games, and the production values are really good, but they're really well scoped, right? Like the production value we're trying to do versus what Free Lives are trying to do is very different, right? So that's not to say like we've made the best game ever made in Africa or whatever. I think it's really just about production value and scale and scope. I think once it's out there, there is a new benchmark for what could be made in Sub-Saharan Africa, even if it makes no money. Secondly, I think part of the goal I still have is the Cypher games industry at least needs to get way more diverse. And this goes into hiring as well. Like when we started this project, the industry was still, 95% white men. Now it's changed a lot across all the studios. But, Nyamakop, I think at one point was like 80% of that 32 was people of color. And I think it's really difficult to start a game studio if you don't have professional experience making a game, particularly in South Africa for very long-standing historical reasons that are related to the post-apartheid economics, right? So part of what's important here is if Nyamakop just collapses in 9 months' time or whatever, you now have all these diverse people who have actually made a game before at a scale that hasn't been made on the continent before. So they're going to be able to get jobs elsewhere in the industry, or maybe they'll start studios, and you'll start seeing more and more diverse studio owners, more and more diverse studios in South Africa, right? So that's also the other part of it. It's like, yes, there's the product, but it's also the way you've made the product makes a big difference. So I can't quite remember your question, but I think it does matter. Yeah, it matters the way you made it as much as what you've made. Like, I really have no idea if it's going to do well. I have no idea. And I think at least I have to cry myself to sleep at night saying, even if it doesn't do well, it mattered and it was important.
Yeah, it mattered. The journey is just as important. And I was going to say the integrity of the project, but that's not quite what I mean. I mean the intention, the shooting straight. Trying to do. You did the best you could. With what you had. So even if it doesn't work commercially, look good. The production values are top notch. I mean, this is coming from someone that watched you guys in the studio saying Nyamakop over and over. Those sort of fine-tuned details. They have long legs beyond this particular production.
Yeah.
I was chatting to just thinking in terms of perspectives and how you build in games. Some of the local guys here. I was chatting to Tabo Tsolo from Space Salad Studios. A cool kid, man.
I love him.
I've chatted to him again a few times over the years, but it's not so much his games that he's making.
Yeah.
It's not that, he made a particular game or did this or that. It's a cool game, this and that. And my particular viewpoint on games isn't so much the game. It's like it's the bigger picture of where the game sits, right? And just chatting to Tabo, the way he thinks about what he produces, and he made that twerking game. Its name escapes me at the moment.
Hot Buns.
Hot Buns. That's it. And I was like, okay, let me find the story behind this. I'm like, it's a team of like 5 dudes making a game about twerking out. Like, oh, that's a bit typical, Tabo. Like, what's that about? And he went into it. He went into the history and its importance of twerking within cultural references. And he did his research. And the way he spoke about that particular production, I was like, this is why I keep speaking to him, because there's thought behind what he does. There's depth behind it. There's and he's not just that, but he's thinking in terms of a business as well. Yeah. His collaborative approach to outside of games, entertainment industries, other brands, the way he's thinking about just setting up his studio in a sustainable manner, it's like that's exactly where you should be at and what you should be doing.
I mean, well, first off, I'll say I'll never make a game like Relooted ever again for a variety of reasons. But I think Space Salad has been around for quite a while now, actually. I mean, I just remember at least Tabo has been around for a while. And they are really smart. I think Space Salad is a good example of a studio I worry about because I've been where they are. There's so many like little ways to get support in the South African scene, little pockets of money and things like that. And you almost feel like I worry that studios are going to get stuck on this sort of like, I don't know, mouse wheel, right? And if you ever give up for a second, you ever stop trying to get those pockets of money, you just fall off it and the studio's done, right? And like they've made some really solid games. I think they have the talent to make even better games. And I'd really love, especially a studio like Space Salad, to be able to be making like particularly internationally competitive games, because they're now starting to sort of lean into what corporate contract work a little bit, which is a great way to sustain yourself, but it's very, very easy to get stuck doing that. Sustainability is the goal, but it's also a trap depending on how early you try and get there. Like Nyamakop, for example, we peaked at 32, but I think we'll be down to near half of that by the time we leave, just because we were very clear with the team. It's like we have contracts, because sustaining that level of burn rate post-launch is insane. The level of financial success you need to have is ridiculous. So sustainability is the goal, but sustainability for sustainability's point doesn't necessarily get us there. And that's what I worry about as well.
Oh, that's an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
What would be your suggestion to him? No, this is not advice for Thabo. I'm just saying, yeah.
Just make better games. No, I don't know. I really don't know. And I think that's part of me wants this game to, well, not part of me, a large part of me wants this game to do really well, not just so that I will be rich.
No,
but
everyone wants it to do well. Yeah. Yeah.
But part of why is because I think if Joburg we have 24-bit, which does fund a lot of stuff here, but if Joburg had like a Free Lives-esque kind of company to like fund and grow and build a community, build elite communities of game developers slowly getting better, then the Joburg scene particularly would explode. Like we have hundreds of people like making games in Joburg, students, hobbyists, whatever. So in terms of the advice I have to get out of that, I don't know. I just know the way I've tried to make games, which won't be sustainable unless the game does well, was directly trying to avoid getting stuck in that sort of sustainability mouse wheel, because I think it can be difficult to get out of it.
So I did want to talk to you a little bit about recruitment, because I know you guys struggled with it.
Yeah.
I know there's a combination of skills, talent, experience, particularly, you're trying to build on a new engine. There's a lot of people doing things for the first time.
Yeah.
How'd you go about it? How'd you solve that problem?
So, I mean, it comes back to the diversity issue of the South African games industry, right? If you're making an African-inspired game, especially one this, like, where authenticity is this important, I don't think I could have made it with people who had made games before in South Africa, which meant I had to hire from outside of the industry. So I had to go and try and find people from related industries. Maka, our lead animator, used to be animation lecturer at the animation school Joburg. Bongani, our art director, was doing matte painting and concept art for like Netflix films and Triggerfish. Mohale, our narrative director, she was writing comic books and novels and all these sort of things. So had to just bring them together. And then once we did that, it was actually really easy to use their networks to continue finding skill sets that were outside of people who had made games. And then we did lean on particularly Wits game design, graduates from there. We've had like maybe 5 or so. So we've had a bit of a mix of people who have actually made games before. And then honestly, I literally used to just search different platforms. I went on ArtStation, put in the skill sets I needed, and literally looked through and then applied every African tag, every country's tagged, and went through them country by country. And our current environment artist, we found him in Ethiopia, and he had 3 textures on his ArtStation. So I sent him an email being like, do you want to make games? And he was like, please. And he was doing advertising in Ethiopia. And just of those 3 textures, he's become unbelievably good. And then I literally searched GitHub, and I literally was like Unreal Engine plus South Africa. And had found this guy he's only in Centurion, but he'd never been involved in the community, but he'd be making tools on the side in Unreal Engine, all this sort of stuff. Had no connection to the scene or the community. First time I emailed him, he was like, no, I'm not interested. And then a few months later, he emailed me and I was like, cool, let's do it. And now he might be one of the best programmers I've ever worked with by far. So the recruitment has been a sort of varied mix of things, but oftentimes it's literally just looking on those platforms, going through every single person there by a skill set in a country, and then emailing people.
And the management of said people?
Impossible. I think my opinion is I'm not sure we can make a bigger game can be made in South Africa or Africa right now. I think 30, maybe 20 is around the cap in terms of a single project, because your big issue is the senior leadership talent having experience. If they're learning how to A, manage, B, do their skill set in games, there's no ways they're going to be able to teach someone else how to do it, like a junior or a mid-level person. So your cap is the senior talent, because it caps how many juniors you can have, because the juniors need help and need the ability to learn and grow. So yeah, I think it's very difficult to make big games. I'm not sure I would do it again based on the skill shortages we'd have, or I'd like very, very slowly build up to it again, because the senior talent experience is the big thing hurting us. And we're a very small scene. You know, we can't just be poaching from each other. Like I can't, like Kevin, our lead programmer, he used to be a 24-bit, and I had to literally like go to Luke, the CEO, and grovel and be like, can I approach him to poach him? Like I had to ask permission, you know, because it's such a small scene.
It's simple manners as well.
Yeah.
It's particularly in a small scene. You don't want to be that guy.
Yeah.
You know, oh, look, I've got money now, blah, 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 blah.
Because we definitely actually do have the talent. It's all just split amongst like 4 or 5 studios, right? And, you know.
I got to pee.
Great.
Can we take a moment? Yeah. Cool. And we're back. Those necessary little pee breaks.
Yeah.
So I remember it was before we went down to Africa Games Week last year. I told you I was writing a story. I was going to write for gamesindustry.biz. Mm-hmm. And that was part of the context of why I was down there. And we even chatted a little bit about it when we were in Cape Town. But the point of that story I was writing for James Batchelor, who incidentally commissioned me on the story, but subsequently left the gamesindustry.biz. And my story fell by the wayside, and the new owners have not picked it up. They don't even have a new editor yet, I don't think. At the point of talking, they don't have a new editor. Who are they owned by now? They were bought by someone. So there were new rules, and then there was a freeze on. Anyway, but the point is, my story didn't get published. But I wrote a story.
Sure, it's great.
And I'll publish it myself. But ideally, I wanted to get paid for it, of course. And when I was down there, I chatted to numerous guys from around Africa, and that's part of the reason I go there, is because it's good for me to just meet other guys that aren't just in Joburg or Cape Town that have similar stories, and ask them about, you know, their particular challenges is with developing studios, and their stories are far and wide. Hey, they're all over the place, but guys are doing impressive work with what they've got. Well, put it this way: their intentions of doing impressive work is there, and they're doing. But, you know, they're all the same stories. The funding, it's a problem. Attracting investment's a problem. So they have the innovative ways of doing things. Obi from Malio Games, Hugo Obi, yes. In Nigeria, he's got a very good head about him. Very good business sense in how he's building a studio. Yeah. But one thing I found at Games Week was it's almost like a lot of studio heads or creatives who want to make games are kind of they're not asking the question directly, as they're essentially asking, why isn't it easier? Mm. And it's the truth for any creative production. It's never going to be easy. Yeah. If it is easy, it kind of, you're not pushing something, you're not pushing an envelope, or you're not making things happen. And I mean, there was guys that, this one guy, I'll forget his name, I'll put it in the description of the video or something, but he effectively he built his own engine to create, from Rwanda. He's an American guy, but he lives in Rwanda now, yeah. I thought that was impressive. Yeah. I mean, that was a starting point. Oh, I can't afford the software, so I'll just build my own. It's like, okay, that's good. That's impressive. And then it's like bootstrap stuff.
Yeah.
And I suppose the point of what I'm asking you is that, and the title of that story was, "Are African games good enough?" And in the context of that, we've discussed it already in the sense of like you're competing against the global market.
Yeah.
The solution to that is yes, I understand your point, make better games. But at least conceptualize your games as well as possible and kind of get some depth into them. Based on that, I wanted to lean in your relationship with. We started talking about it and how you got introduced to them, but we didn't actually finish that story.
I mean, the actual practicalities of it are, in some ways, weirdly simple. You make a pitch deck, and then you go on a call, and you pitch it to them verbally, and then they might play the build if you had one. We didn't have one at that time. And then they give you a term sheet, they give you a contract. And with us, obviously, it was the prototype period first, where they wanted to figure out if the game was good enough. And then once they saw the prototype, they were like, cool, let's do it. And you sign a different contract, and the contract's made up of all these milestones of different lengths, depending on what you discuss. In that contract, it's also like, what percentage are they recouping from sales? What profit share do they get? All that sort of stuff. You go through all of that. And then you just start making the game.
So just to back up,
Yeah.
so they never. It's still your IP. They didn't essentially buy your IP.
No, it's actually very uncommon for indie games to let go of the IP. There's a lot of like contractual things that, to some extent, are basically owning the IP, like right of first refusal on sequels, stuff like that. But no, it's pretty uncommon for indie games to have the IP be owned by someone else.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they funded you, and they gave you timelines, they gave you some cash. That's how you ended up at WeWork in Rosebank.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, we only really got an office because of load shedding, to be honest. Yeah. Because we needed.
At the time, load shedding was big. Yeah.
It was big. Yeah.
We've come so far in this country. Our load shedding is almost a thing of the past.
Yeah.
So when you say you have to go find a new publisher,
Yeah.
how does that work exactly? Like do you need a publisher, or you just say Nyamakop now you're just putting your game on Steam?
So essentially, releasing a game, the publishing part, like for the most part, indies work with publishers because they give them development money, right? But they also do the publishing and also pay for the publishing. The publishing side is not hugely complicated. There's an art form to it, but it is also expensive, right? So let's say localization, for example. You want to translate your game into 10 languages, EFIGs, Italian, French, Italian, German, Spanish, probably Brazilian, Portuguese, because the market's huge there. Definitely Chinese as well. It probably costs about maybe 10 to 15 cents, US dollars, cents per word.
No.
Yeah.
Really? That's a lot.
It is. I mean, it can be cheap if you just put it in ChatGPT, but it's not very good. So then, like, if you're making a game of like, I don't know, 50 to 100,000 words, whatever, every language is like $10,000. So translating the game could be $100,000. And then you talk about porting, which, 24-bit is their bread and butter. That probably costs $100,000 to $200,000 to do externally. Then you've got marketing, which could be usually like 20% to some other percent of the development budget, which could be a few $100,000 as well. So it might cost you like, I don't know, 100 Rand to make a game, but it costs you another 50 Rand to publish it at the very least.
So when you're saying publisher, I suppose, again, I'm guessing I wasn't understanding exactly how it worked. And so when you were saying to me looking for a new publisher, you were actually you weren't looking for funding per se, you were looking for someone to cover those costs of publishing.
I mean, ideally, I was just looking for funding. The funding is the issue. Because if you have the money, you can do the same thing that publishers do. Because a lot of the time, they're just paying for external service providers to do those services, right? And managing and overseeing it. They have gotten very good at doing it. And they obviously are very good at marketing. They have weight with storefronts as well, and like platforms like Xbox and PlayStation. And those relationships are important. But in terms of publishing at its core, it's like very few people do a lot of that stuff internally anyway. So if you have the money to pay for it to be done anyway, you don't necessarily need a publisher. and giving up what you're essentially, when you work with a publisher, usually they're taking maybe 80 to 100% of all the money from sales until their investment is recouped. And then after that, they're taking 30 to 50% of all profit. When in large part, for the most part, a lot of us indies are cynical, they're really just a bank. You are just risking their money. No one's going to take your house, like if you took that money from a bank, right? But for the most part, they're funding the development, but the actual expertise can be a bit limited on the publishing side. If you have the money to pay for that same expertise yourself, it can be as successful as if you were with a publisher. So when you say looking for a publisher, it's like, yeah, you're looking to give that amount up in exchange for like more funding for them to pay for all those publishing services, but you're also looking for funding in case you can just do that yourself, or you just have to like bootstrap it out yourself.
So when you say we're launching this, we're the 1st of May at this recording, you say you're going to be launching it next month. Announcing it. Does that mean now you've found a publisher?
No.
Okay, so explain that part to me. So you're going ahead and announcing it.
Yeah.
Is that just a strategic move in order to try and find a publisher, or do you have that set up already?
So the industry shifted a little bit where now people want games announced and like want Steam wish lists, which show that there's a certain amount of interest in the game before you go to publishers. So that can help you find a publisher. But also realistically, our runway is not going to run forever. So we have to ship the game and start making revenue at some point, right? You want as much time to market the game as possible. Ideally, at least 6 months to do it from announce to like launch, to build up those wish lists, which kickstart the Steam algorithm, and then the algorithm does everything for you. So we're announcing it so that we can talk about it, so that we can get people to wishlist the game, so that when the game comes out, they convert and it makes money. So we're announcing because we have to some extent. It's also probably about time, really. You know, it's been a long time. We could announce and then still get a publisher and maybe only release next year, who knows? But, you know, if you're actually wanting to get revenue from the game, you have to be marketing it and talking about it.
I suppose, fortune favors the bold. Yeah. At some point, you just got to go out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even that bold. It's pretty fundamental. It's just figuring out how to do stuff internally, getting someone to make a trailer, hiring a PR team. It's a lot of work to do it yourself, but it's not rocket science, you know, to some extent. Yeah. I think it's more just scary in terms of, you know, especially if you've worked on something privately for so long, you don't know how it's going to be received. It could be huge. It could be not huge. I've been through this before with Semblance even, right? So, yeah.
Okay. Well, good luck to that. I think I think that's like the biggest fear of any creative endeavor. It's just like, oh, okay, now I've got to, at some point you got to put it out there. At some point you got to just kind of take it on the chin, you know? Yeah. And just hope for the best. And just, I'm very curious as to what your marketing material looks like. You say your marketing budget is really small. I mean, like I said, I did want some big banners. Look over the skyline. I want to see some big, Relooted banners. But so you got to foot the bill for that marketing at the moment.
Yeah.
Is that something publishers would normally foot? Okay.
But it also comes out of what they recoup from the sales as well. So the situation we are in now is every dollar we earn comes straight to us, which is not many indie game developers get the chance to make a game and with this amount of funding and then be able to launch it and just receive all the money directly. Okay, so
yeah, I mean everything's on your shoulders. It's kind of like it's a nice space to be in, I think, in the sense of like this particular large project. You said the staffing you said it would go down to about 12, 13, whatever, 15, whatever, go down to like half of what you currently were building at. If, say, for example, what's your long-term planning here? Is, say, for example, you do get decent revenue from the game and you're able to continue Nyamakop, kind of can stay in its present form. What projects do you have stuff lined up, say, to capitalize on that increased revenue? to ride the wave, right? Like you can't say, oh, we made some money, cool, and then just kind of wait until all the money's gone again. You got to, at some point, you got to say, okay, we're running a business. Money comes in, you've got to use it, you know?
Yeah. I think a few people have proven models. Free Lives is one, Landfall in Sweden is another, where it's like if you have the revenue and the money to prototype for as long as possible, it can be very difficult to mess up. It takes a lot of skill and ability, and it takes a lot of time to get good at prototyping. But if you can just spend that money prototyping and releasing stuff publicly and seeing what hooks people before you commit all that more time and money to it, you're quite risk averse compared to like the way Relooted has been made. So if the game does well and we're able to keep existing, we'll essentially transition into more of a Free Lives-esque model where we're making stuff, putting it out there, very early testing if there's an audience for the thing, and then taking it to publishers or then self-funding it and self-publishing it. So you know you're spending like way less money. You know, like to make a prototype of a game, you can make a prototype of a game in 78 hours, 48 hours, maybe a week, maybe a few months. That's a fraction of the cost it'll take to develop the game fully.
So there's always, I think I'm quite mistaken in this actually. This is the way I've previously thought, but I'm learning that, okay, it doesn't actually work like this. It's kind of like an IP theft of some sort. Like when you put your stuff out publicly, before you've got paperwork behind it, or before you're just pushing out creative ideas. So exactly. So in that sense, to me, it's always like, oh, but someone could take the idea. But no one can really. Idea is just an idea. There's work behind that particular prototype. There's work that goes into building a game or any other sort of creative endeavor. Because you've released it publicly, no one can really steal it anyway. And even if they do just rush out and say, oh, that's a good idea, let's build it first. Outside of the dick factor, you're just kind of, it's going to be different anyway. So, I mean, how do you get around it? You're not the only developer that said that to me, like the best way to develop games is just to push up prototypes and just chase the audience reaction before you chasing an idea, because there's no guarantees of anything in just ideas. But if you got some sort of audience traction, it just gives you that incentive, at least some sort of, you're not necessarily in a safe space, but you're in a space where it makes sense for you to pursue that particular track. I think,
I mean, I have thoughts about this that I have completely disregarded making Relooted. Relooted was...
Because you're very hush-hush about it.
Yeah, and didn't enjoy it, and we won't do it again. Like NDAs, and part of that was working with a publisher, but part of that was just ourselves, to be honest. And part of the reason for that is we had early concept art. Only one piece of concept art has ever been posted from the game, and it's not attributed to Nyamakop or the game. And then I found out that piece of art ended up in a pitch deck to a very large international entertainment company to pitch.
See, that's that dick factor. People do that.
So the concept of the game in of itself is so strong with nothing else that I decided to be a bit more cautious than I usually would be, because usually an idea doesn't matter and execution is everything. But at a certain percentile, like the elite level of entertainment makers, ideas do really matter. Because when you can take execution for granted to some extent, then ideas are more important. So it's almost like this bell curve of how much, or reverse bell curve maybe, of how much ideas actually matter. For 80% of people making stuff, you shouldn't be worried about your ideas. So that's the Relooted part of it. In terms of generally and how I think about it, in games, no one's going to clone something that isn't good. That's the reality as well. And Semblance has a clone on the App Store, the Google Play Store, with 1 million downloads. And essentially what they seem like they did is they took the app, decompiled the code into a Unity project, because they have the exact same visual bugs to the terrain deformation that we do. So it's the same code. So there's nothing you can do to stop that. You can get it taken down, but it's like you're going to spend the rest of your life doing takedowns, right? So like cloning is kind of just part of the industry. It's not much you can really do. And in some ways, something getting cloned shows it was good. And secondly, there's an argument that people have made, which I think is true. The people who play cloned games aren't the people who will play your game either. The audience overlap is very different. Because most of the cloning that happens on mobile. And those folks are like just pumping out clones, doing paid user acquisition, seeing what works, right? But if you're making a PC or a console game, is losing the mobile audience a really big issue? Probably not.
And you didn't consider making mobile from the get-go as part of the execution? Or is that not how it works normally?
Yeah, no, you have to think about it from the get-go, for sure, especially with mobile. We considered it, but again, the issue is just like mobile is wild. It's the Wild West, and it's even worse in Africa. If you want to focus on Africa, it's almost more expensive than PC and console development now because the paid user acquisition costs are so high. There are like specialized banks which loan you money just for paid user acquisition in mobile games. Mobile is not for the weak of heart. I'm not sure why that's where people try and start. You just pay $100, you can upload a build on Steam and it's done. You know, I guess the same with mobile, but you're going to sync faster. So I think with IP stuff, we went through a situation where I genuinely thought there was risk to the IP being out there. I don't think I'm going to work on another game in my entire life where they'll probably be true, realistically. And generally, I don't think it's something people should worry about. Definitely not if it's going to stop you putting it out there, you know. And the same argument could be made for Relooted and us, and maybe we should have put it out there sooner. We'll see.
I think your particular context in making this game is unique to here.
Yeah.
Do you consider it unique in the American market?
In terms of getting project investment?
Yeah.
No. I mean, this is kind of what I speak to in terms of like the games need to be better. I've done it twice now with Semblance, straight out of university, and now with this game, just talking to publishers, and you're pitching like dozens and dozens of them, and I think I've had 3, 4, maybe 5 deals in total on the table ever out of all those pitches. But it's definitely possible. There's a lot of publishers out there, a huge number. There's less and less now because of the bubble, but there's now new ones coming up as well. So there's a lot of project investment out there. The ranges there's a quite big range, anything from $100,000 to $1 million. Then there's like certain funding gaps where it's like $1 million to $2 million. There isn't people doing that, but like $2 to $5 million, there's more people. But no, it's not rare. And most successful indie games that we see these days are funded by publishers with that model, at least to start, before they generate their own revenue. And so when I say, again, the games need to be better, it's not even just about at the store page level. The games need to be better because we're competing internationally with other game devs.
So more specifically, should you say the pitch deck needs to be better?
Somewhat, but actually just the prototypes need to be better. If we learn how to prototype better, because that's what the publishers want. I think it's changing a little bit, and now they want a vertical slice. But if the prototype is really, really good, you know, there's people out there that will fund the whole development. And our prototypes that we make in South Africa and Africa, on average, aren't necessarily where they should be. I think Free Lives' Jam Doll is trying to change that exact problem. But I think it's actually...
What's that project? I'm not familiar with that.
The Jam Doll?
Yeah.
Something Free Lives does are essentially they have a fund, and then you can pitch them with an idea that you'll make in 2 weeks. And you have to release that on itch.io. There's all these other things you have to do. They give you feedback. You have to update it. And then at the end of this like short process of 2 to 4 weeks, they'll give you a little lump sum of money. It's not huge, but it's theoretically enough for offsetting costs, especially with newer people entering the scene.
Gives you a little bit of a foothold.
Yeah. Okay. And it's encouraging you to focus on prototyping and making better prototypes.
You mentioned earlier, so, I mean, just looking at your timeline here, if you're saying you're making an announcement of the intention of the game next month, yeah. You're suggesting within 6 months or so you need to ship something.
Yeah.
assuming it's successful.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you'd be considering supporting the local game devs with a similar type of structure, or how are you thinking about it?
A lot of things. I think Free Lives is really successful because of the way they've managed to like help, particularly the Cape Town scene, in terms of just being like a bastion for like elite game development and giving feedback and advice, getting people into the industry. I don't think Joburg necessarily has that. We obviously have 24-bit, but it's a very different kind of game development. So if we have like a place or a studio that like is helping and bringing people together and giving them feedback on their games, making it better, maybe a little bit of funding, a little bit of support, bringing in international developers to Joburg to do stuff. There's like a long range of things you can do, but you need to be sustainable and have spare cash to be able to do it. Because, you know, like we have these meetups at Goethe, the Goethe Institute every month, and there's like, what, 100, 140 people there sometimes? Like, that's a very large community. But no one's able to take the next step into professionally making games if you don't end up in Nyamakop or at 24-bit, really.
Oh man, her name just escaped me. She was on a panel with you. You've worked with her before. Moeti, her first name? Dimpo, yeah. Dimpo, with an L, but Dimpo, yeah. She said something along the lines of, and I disagreed with it, and I'm not sure, but maybe I'm just not fully understanding what she meant. She said the intention shouldn't be about studios doing their own thing and building the studio. They should be the focus should be on building ecosystem and infrastructure to be building the local ecosystem for making games. And I think that in the context of when she said that was, it was pretty sure it was the same panel you were on. And I was like, you've got to build good games first. I mean, what does it mean to build an ecosystem without product or without, so I mean, maybe it's the cart before the horse or whichever. I mean, I think I maybe just misunderstood what she meant, but I don't know what your views are on that. Or, I mean, you've worked with her, so
I think that's what you said. I'll just go based on what you said. I agree with you. And actually, I sort of pulled myself out of community development, particularly in Joburg, several years ago, right when Amaze Johannesburg died, just because of our frustration that it was like, there are almost too many stakeholders pulling in too many different directions, and none of the stakeholders are necessarily like prominent, successful game developers, at least at the time in Joburg. And I was like, I think the only way I can really sort of start to grow the community and make the community look the way I want to do it is to make this big, very successful game. And then once that's done, we'll have, what would you call it? The prestige, the capital, both politically, socially, and financially, to start nurturing the scene. So I would fundamentally agree with you. And that's almost been another reason for why we've made the game the way we have.
Okay.
Because I think it's I spend a lot of time traveling, and not as much as I used to, but a lot of the reason I do that is to spend time with successful professional indie game developers. Because it's very difficult to get good at making games if you're not getting feedback or hearing about what's happening in the industry from people who are operating at that level. And in Joburg, we just don't have that compared to like Cape Town. And even in Cape Town, Nyamakop's like one of the few people who's in South Africa who's got publisher funding in the specific way. So I think that's the issue in Joburg, is like we don't have these sort of elite game developers with a true connection to the international game scene outside of a few of us. And even then it's like, it doesn't feel like it's enough to move the needle.
Well, let's hope it comes right. I mean, I think there's some really cool creativity going on here.
Yeah.
People being able to do some really cool work. I suppose there's you just need the means to be able to do it.
Yeah, the means and the focus and the feedback. Like, there's a lot of really good skill in South Africa and Joburg particularly, but the way it's being used isn't getting people where they need to go. And a big part of that is they don't have the sustainability and the funding to be able to do that. but also they don't necessarily have the feedback or the guidance to get there possibly. And I'd love to be proved wrong. But I think, again, we have to come back to at the international standard, which is where we need to be competing.
When you, who do you mean really when you say stakeholders in the industry? As in,
I mean,
people able to make money or wanting to make money from the scene? Or are you talking about sort of brand associations? Or are you talking about the creatives?
Like everything from cultural institutions to educational institutions to like the studio heads. Like there's just a lot of moving parts needed and a lot of people moving in different directions, different priorities. You know, like when you look at something like WITS, you know, WITS's priority is probably to, you know, generate master's degrees and research, because that's what academic institutions do, right? They're not necessarily that interested in making sure that the quality of the craft of making games is as high as it could be, because that's not necessarily what university is supposed to do either, right? But then you might have studio heads like 24-bit. 24-bit's priority is going to be developing talent that they can hire to make very specific kind of technical tasks porting games, while Nyamakop's will be different. The cultural institutions have their own agenda. It's just like there's a moving like hodgepodge of different like stakeholders, and no individual one is strong enough to like overrule everyone else. And to some extent that just means we're just sort of spinning the wheels in terms of like what happens. Like there's a lot of stuff, people doing stuff, but it's not like, it feels separate. It's not like moving us together. So my thought has always been, make a really good game, make a lot of money so that there can be one like singular focus moving forward to some extent.
So I found the quote now from Dimpo. She said, what's good for the industry isn't just one great game. It's building an ecosystem where every studio has the tools to succeed. I think in the context of what you said, that's probably true.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, I suppose it's just I might have to beep this out, but my capitalist tendencies, in the sense of like, if I'm a studio and I make a great game, that's my business. I made the game, I made it work. Yes, because there's another part of me that's very much left of center where I'd be like, okay, I'm also interested in saying, yeah, what's the support of this? But I've got to do well first.
Yeah.
I can't be in a space where, and I can use the parallels with, you know, media startups, entrepreneurial media startups, in the sense that many guys now are going for funding as a media startup. It's, to me, that makes sense a little bit in terms of just gets you that funding to get started. But at the same time, it's not a business model. It's not for me as a startup. It's not good enough for me to get funding from either a big international organization. It doesn't create the context for me to own that space or own my product, even though on paper you do. The context of building like that doesn't fit in as nicely for me. Even though I would probably agree with the argument that it's a valid way to get started. And I think, I suppose, I don't know if about that statement in the sense that there's probably like that project-based sort of funded international funders, incubation hubs, that sort of space whereby, you know, you get tick box to say, okay, now you can be part of our project, you build something. And again, the parallel I'm making, it's not directly related to games, but in the sense of like, because I have a strong interest in immersive media and developing XR projects. Those particular projects that earmark be part of the funding, I don't get funding for that kind of stuff, even though I've applied. Like, definitely not. They'll be like, dude, whatever, you know, they'll do somewhere else. So, but my bigger picture with that is, even if the projects that are made are really good, they don't have like there's no like post-project distribution, or it's not a project that sits nicely in the public sphere. It doesn't stand on its own 2 feet. It's more like it's part of that ecosystem within that institution, whereby it could be a good project, sure. But okay, what's the relevancy? It's like academics writing essays for their colleagues down the hall. You know?
100%. And I think, again, my point just comes down to, it's like there's all this stuff happening, but I've actually banged this drum so long that I've even forgotten how long I've been talking about it. And talking about it made me remember how fiercely I fought this. The only thing we should be thinking about is prototypes. All this other stuff is noise, and it doesn't really help us. And I think Free Lives with the Jam Doll is actually helping move us in that direction. Free Lives a few years ago was on an Evan actually was on a panel a few years ago at Afro Games Week, and he basically said he had no interest in growing Free Lives in terms of like staff count. And for a while I was like, oh, Evan, that's so, you can't say that. We've got to grow the industry. And then I had 32 employees making a game, and I'm not actually making a game. I'm managing other people making a game. And the longer I've run Nyamakop, the more I understand Free Lives as a model and why they don't want to do certain things. It's not even about like hoarding the money, but it's like to actually do that work is exhausting and not fun. Free Lives actually pours a huge amount of money into the South African games industry, whether it's a Jam Doll, Playtopia, and they've done it for a while. I think I just wish we could all do more, but I understand why anyone who does succeed doesn't do more, because at the end of the day, we got into it to make games. So,
and also you end up dealing with politics anyway. I mean, I don't want to deal with politics. That's why I don't want a job in like another big media institution. I'll bleep this out because I do actually need a job. But another big media institution
is going to be bleeped out.
Because you just end up dealing with you don't have a focus on the product. You don't have a focus on building cool stuff. You have a focus on playing politics with your colleagues that want your job or something else. And it's not conducive. And it's a particular issue in my experience anyway. It happens all around the world, of course, but it's a particular issue in South Africa. Like media companies in South Africa are almost fiercely toxic in that sort of sense. Yeah. There's not a sense of, you've got so many really great brands, strong brands doing good, and they're good with good journalists, but they're just not able to like tip over into like making really cool products because they're not listen to guys like me and product people, or they take their eye off to being the product. Then they're focusing on positions and egos and it's just not in politics. And this is really not what I want to talk about. But you made me angry,
Sorry.
Ben. You got me into it. Cool. I think in terms of wrapping up, I mean, we could probably go on for a little bit, but. I think we've touched most of the bases. This thing of, it bugs me to talk about it in the sense of the African game. Because when you think about it, the guys in Asia, for example, they're making Asian games. I
think a bad example, because in China, they actually are. And I think, sorry, you want to wrap things up, but
go for it,
I think my frustration with the African game thing is focusing on Africa, which is like so many different countries, regulations, language, culture, so different. China and India are one country. China has one time zone, which makes no sense. The regulations are pretty similar. Everyone's got familiar with the culture. There's a lot of diversity there for sure, but it's like it is one unit. Africa is nowhere close. So like focusing in terms of that homogeneity, right? It's so diverse across every aspect. So the African like game, for which African, in which country, it doesn't exist. And I hope it changes, but that's why our game is trying to like at least try and make the African game for people who actually can access it.
Well, you certainly scored points with me, and when you said, guys, your voiceover artists just speak the way they speak. For me, that was a big box tick. That was like, oh, thank God. Trying to manufacture something that sounds African just never works.
And what's funny is a lot of our voice actors, when they came in, were like, oh, what accent do you want me to do? Like they expected us to ask them to change the accent.
Well, thanks for coming in, man. I'm really looking forward to playing the game.
Me too. I hope it does well. Otherwise,
sounds like it's going to be amazing. And the stuff I've seen of it, the visuals I've seen, looks good. I was lucky enough to see some of the movement in your studios. Even they were discussing one of the artifacts at the time. So I was lucky enough to see some of that, and it's looking good, man. Looking polished. All I can say is congratulations on sticking it out and playing the game, and no pun intended, and just kind of stay in the course.
Thanks, man. I hope it goes well for my ego and also my career after all the things I've said on this podcast. So.
You haven't said anything. You haven't said anything controversial. It's been a good chat. Yeah, thanks for coming in, man. Appreciate it.
No worries, man. Thanks.